researcher advisor at the Institute of Culture and Memory Studies in Ljubljana. Of interest include post-socialist studies, memory studies, labor history, gender history, linguistic anthropology. She is interested in uses and meanings of socialist and Yugoslav legacy in post-Yugoslav societies, as well as in cultural, linguistic, political, and social processes that shapes the reality of these societies. She's author of many important publications, books, monographs, and so. Please, Tanja, the last conclusion.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you also for inviting me. It was a really enjoyable way to spend last 2 days. It's not an easy task to trying to be someone who will give a final word here, not because there are no common threads I can pull out. Of course, there are many of them. But simply what we could hear last 2 days is extremely rich, and I will in no way be able to manage to cover all the important aspects you brought during your presentations and during our common discussions. So I will be inevitably selective, but I will try to tease out several mainly conceptual issues which I hope can then allow us maybe taking our discussion a bit further. I won't speak long, so I will leave a couple of minutes at least, or maybe 10-15 minutes for kind of closing or final thoughts also from the other, from your side. For me, important thing here during these last 2 days was that we were focusing also on general issues of female labor and forces regulating it. But we were mainly speaking from two positions of liminality. One is, of course, transitional post-war, post-conflict period, which is inevitably a time of suspension, of a time when things are not settled, not defined, or they are defined anew. So there are many changes kind of anticipated, but we are still in a kind of moment of suspension there. And of course we can speak about, and we spoke about, post-conflict, post-war transitional periods in different geographical points, but what this project is about and what most of presentations and discussions were about are also liminal, is also a kind of a liminal space, a space that is not just any space in a post-war transition, but a space that is deeply contested and that was subject of tremendous political and other changes, changes of authorities, changes of state belonging, changes in terms of demographic structure, and so on. And I think this is something which is important, and I will constantly go back to this, to the nature of this liminal space and what it did for women and their labor possibilities and the regimes that regulated their labor. We heard about a whole plethora of different modalities in which women were engaged in the labor market in post-war periods. And I think what became clear at the end, although we also spoke about very different instances on the spectrum from private to public, we can take servants as a kind of labor that is happening in the private sphere, but we could clearly see that what they did and what they embedded were not outside the political and not outside of kind of some very important public discussions on national belonging, on nation building, on welfare state, and so on. So that may be the first point I want to make, that simply there is no there is no instance of female labor, or labor that matter in general we discuss here, which is outside of political. Although sometimes, of course, political work was part of the agenda, was more explicit, and sometimes it was simply political, the politicization was there because simply these women could not be outside the political, especially in the spaces and times which were charged with political, social, and other tensions. What we did also, we were constantly going back to several important concepts that define the nature of women and working women, and these would be the concept of, these were recurring terms: emancipation, autonomy, political engagement. And what I think became clear is that we heard that most of these concepts can be simply also dismissed as such because they don't say much, or they are already very contested. But anyway, they are relational. We cannot speak about them in very global or neutral terms. Emancipation cannot be measured objectively or from some neutral viewpoint. It's also very, very relative to the, what's the starting point, what are consequences, and so on. We could see that entering labor market for women was not necessarily a path to emancipation, and also they did not always embrace possibilities for political engagement. I think it's very important to ask why is that so and when it becomes relevant. If we think about emancipation as such, I think it's very important to ask how this concept in concrete case studies, in concrete, in specific geographical and also temporal context, pairs with welfare state provisions, with nation-building processes, and of course with very particular family context these women are coming from. It will be very different speaking of both emancipation and political activism if we take into account very discrete manifestations of all these three levels. We could also hear, and that was something really, one of the most striking things we kind of witnessed here, is that it's a common knowledge, and another thing also to be in a way deconstructed is the fact that we know that the entrance into labor force for many women was something we perceive and discuss as the lowest strata of labor marketplace. Women were typically engaged massively in low-skilled or non-skilled labor. They are still being engaged in that kind of labor also today, but more discrete and fine analysis also show that there are ways to negotiate your own skills and values also in this kind of labor. I think this should not be dismissed as irrelevant or something very endemic for local workshop, shop floor context. Even more striking is something we could hear from Dagmar about Marie Tusch and her kind of skyrocketing path from this very low strata labor situation into Austrian parliament. And the question I think we should, in a way, ask is what really enables that. We can speak about that on longue durée, from longue durée perspective. Imagine something like that happening today in any of the countries we are coming from. Rather impossible, right? Imagine it happening in the places we heard in another keynote speech on, textile workers in Bangladesh and other places. Not necessarily we should go away so far away. We can simply see what's happening in Serbia, in Bulgaria, and other countries where you have these gray zones of investment factories, very typically textile industry, with no possibility of unionizing, no real workers' rights allowed whatsoever. So this this possibility of a worker in a textile industry to make a political career in that way is something that we should really ask ourselves, how was it possible, and to which extent this liminality I started with in a way facilitated this this path, this biographical path, which seems pretty much unlikely in more stable social contexts. The public and the private division I already referred to seems very important to me, seems something that also dissolves in a way when we try to speak more concretely about how the work really was done. And I think this also kind of invites to think about other binaries we also discussed here, especially today, about formal and informal work and their relationships to the political, to the welfare state, to the ways this labor was also regulated of different formal instances in different periods. That also invites us to stress that it's not only the post-war periods and the war as a rupture itself and the following ruptures that were happening in the liminal spaces, like the one we were mostly discussing here these 2 days. The ruptures and the changes is not the only processes we should be attentive of. There are a lot of continuities, there are a lot of similarities, there are a lot of legacies being brought through despite the changes that seem very revolutionary. So the domestic work in socialism is one of these, the things I'm having in mind speaking about that, and there are of course many others in socialist context. When we tend to think of clear categories, there were actually many gray zones, especially for female labor. And we were discussing in the break, for instance, the work in the entertainment industry, all these singers and musicians who were working in private restaurants. They were in a way outside of the labor market, but not totally outside. And this gray zone is, I would say, a very productive point to look at and to think of different modalities which are outside of what is explicitly visible and regulated on the kind of very top level. We touched upon and discussed thoroughly several spaces of female worker. It was typically housework and domestic work. It was industrial work in a way as an alternative to this modality of female labor, and then other more skilled work like teachers, nurses, of course intellectuals as well. All of this, I think, and most of presenters absolutely were embracing it in their presentations, really calls for something we today also take for granted, that that's intersectional approach, where we don't disentangle gender as such from class, from gender, from ethnicity, and also, as it was stressed at some point, from age. And also going back to the liminality of space and time we are highlighting here, there are also other categories to be taken seriously, and that's a category of being a refugee, being a migrant, being a member of a minority. The female labor and labor in general here cannot be detached from all these categories. They defined actually the nature of that labor and its political, social, and other meanings. And maybe for the end, another approach I would strongly suggest to kind of take seriously, and some of you were doing that, and this is this kind of biographical approach where we take seriously entire biographical paths, to the extent, of course, it's possible when we work with archival materials and when we don't have an opportunity to really grasp the whole trajectory because we cannot assess that from the past. But actually, already the first, in the beginning of our meeting here, the notion of generation was brought. That's something very important, and I think that would be really important to kind of take that lens and think of female labor in different contexts through the concept and through the lens of generation. That will show continuities, that will also open a clear perspective on social mobility and who are actors who actually enable that social mobility, to which extent it comes from the family, from mothers, from fathers at some point, so to which extent it comes from the welfare state context that simply enables it as such. I think this is something very relevant for the discussion we had here, and maybe for the very end, we spoke about different categories of female labor, and I think, and also that came into discussion, and for instance, for servants and domestic work, labor and industrial labor, the kind of, those two are seen as alternatives, and very often we think of these two domains of female labor as something you can make choice between, and that was really like that, I would say, in many contexts. So I think generally it's important to ask about all these categories of working women and domains of female labor, to which extent we can speak about porosity of these domains, of transfer from one domain to another, and even more interesting or important, about solidarities and ties that could be built between different domains, or for that matter, tensions, or fortifying social distance, or social relations based on class, which, as we could see, were not, did not disappear in socialism even. Of course, they were still there, but they had to be renegotiated. And to which extent it, again, interferes and intertwines with the categories I was mentioning, like how it looks like when we speak about migrant women, when we speak about refugees, when we speak about older or younger women, how all these solidarities or alliances can be established across the social strata. And again, for the end, how this liminal temporal frame and space of the post-war, very tumultuous region, we are speaking about what possibilities were of this liminality open, and on the other hand, what possibilities were closed by this suspension, unsolved status, waiting for some stability to come and so on. So I will end up here. We still have, I think, 15 minutes for maybe bringing some new questions or trying to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanja, for this very punctual and important conclusion. I open shortly discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Tanja. A very nice wrap-up of these 2 days. I was wondering, and maybe this is not something to throw into a group 15 minutes before the end and before lunch, but maybe for the future, are you familiar with the term that has been coined by Marxist feminists over the past years, affective labor, and to what extent that would be a useful concept? Because it's, of course, it's taken on because of the maybe more gender neutral possibilities of the term, but well, I was wondering what you would think of that, and if that would be a way forward or not at all, because it also relates, of course, to hyper-globalism, to hyper-capitalism, and to the commodification of all kinds of services that, from ages were seen as womanly or feminine, etc. So it's more of a
finish this workshop. Outside it's sunny, and now I think that we have time for lunch. But at the end, naturally, a lot of thanks for the staff, Fiesta and Juliana staff, and now also thanks Božidar for your support, photo, and support. And thank you naturally for all contributes, for all suggestions, questions, remarks. And yes, now I think that we have a nice time in Trieste. Enjoy in the weekend. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes to make a